You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Small-town crime can include some of the most chilling and heinous murders that the world has ever, unfortunately, witnessed. However, being in a small town, these crimes often get overlooked, but not on True Crimecast.
Join Jamie and John as they discuss a different crime or spree of crimes each week. The crimes covered range from some of the most infamous cases to small-town Appalachian murder mysteries that have flown under the radar until now. When you're looking for your next great listen, be sure to check out True Crimecast wherever you listen to your podcast. Proudly distributed by Stoveleg Media.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey guys, whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance. Then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options.
Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our look at the case of Leo Schofield. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my fetch co-host, Alice.
Stop trying to make that happen, Brett.
Such a good movie.
That was great. Oh, well done. Well done. So you have watched it, and
of course I've watched
quote it word for word. Man. Okay.
You know, they're remaking it
sometimes. I'm so confused. Like, is it the same movie, or is it like
it's a
the
remake?
Next Generation?
It's a remake.
So it's a remake. It is not like these are my big sisters.
No, it's a remake. My understanding, it's a remake based on the musical.
Oh.
So there was a musical.
I feel like it's a little, maybe I know I'm old, but it feels like a little soon for a remake. Like, shouldn't we make Sound of Music first, which was like much older than say
Can't remake Sound of Music.
I agree. You also can't remake Mean Girls.
Yeah, I don't really understand the point of remaking Mean Girls. Though Mean Girls is like, what, 20 years old now?
That's why I said I get that I'm actually old. But anyways, thank you for that callback. That It's exactly what we need right now on this cold, cold night, which, by the way, I think by the middle of next week, maybe the next time we record Leo, it's going to be like 80 degrees.
I know. It's going to be amazing. I can't wait. Okay. We got a ton to get to today, Alice. So I think we're going to try and make it through the rest of the trial. It's a lot. So if we don't make it, it's not going to be the end of the world, but we're going to try and make it. So we're going to try and be reserved, all those 1-star review comments about how I need to stop being so repetitive. We're going to try and take those to heart. So here we go.
Because we're trying to get through everything today, we've decided to just cut the intro music and the outro music for all future episodes.
Exactly. For all future episodes.
Never.
I said that on Patreon, and they were like, all these people either very happy or very sad. It's like, yeah, we're not actually going to do that. Okay. So first of all, some questions that you guys have asked. It's a great thing about recording this with patrons is we get a bunch of questions. So just very quickly to go through a couple questions people have asked. Number one, where did Michelle park at the restaurant? And did anyone see her drive to Sparky's? So she parked in front, and people did see her drive towards Sparky's. And the person working at Sparky's, that's the gas station, also remembered her stopping in before they closed. And that's when she asked if they had a telephone. Some people have asked, why didn't she know if they had a telephone? Well, remember, she was really bad about letting Leo know where she was going to be and when she was going to be there. So it's not that surprising that maybe she didn't know there was a telephone there. So that's the first thing. The second thing, how do we know Michelle called from Sparky's? Were there phone records? No, there weren't records. So there are no phone records. All we know is she called Leo at the time that we told you that she called. And because she asked the person if there was a phone, sort of the logical extension is that that's what she did. It was the closest phone to their trailer. It was right down the road. So most likely after she went to the trailer and cleaned up, she drove back to Sparky's and made the phone call.
I also do recognize, and some of you have pointed it out, it is a little bit weird for her to ask Sparky's if there's a phone there, if this is the closest phone to their trailer and it's the one closest to where she works. In other words, of all the places she is, mostly where she works and where she lives, you would think that she would know where the closest phone is. I have a couple things to say about this. It's very possible she didn't actually ask, where's your phone? But whoever remembers, people probably ask Sparky's where their phone is all the time because this is a time when people did not have cell phones. So it's a common question to be asked. But she may have said something along the lines of, is your phone free or is it up? Because if you remember back in the days, a lot of payphones did not work. Like most of the payphones I remember back in the early 90s didn't work. We'd go payphone to payphone because the line had been cut or it just wasn't functioning. It's possible that she had asked something along those lines, and what was conveyed after the fact was she asked where the phone was.
Great point. And that's absolutely a possibility. So the other thing we know is that Leo told the people he was with that night, which is the Andersons, his bandmates, that Michelle had just called after going by their trailer and she was going to be there in a minute to pick him up. Now, why did she call this night when she hadn't called before? I think the reason is to let Leo know that she would be late because she was going to McDonald's. But Leo told her they would just go together. So I think an important thing is there's really no reason to doubt any of this conversation unless you think Leo was already planning on killing Michelle that night and had constructed all this to explain to his friends where she'd been for the last hour. But remember, it couldn't have been to explain unusual things found in the trailer. The fact that, her purse was there and her wallet was there, or her shoes were there, that sort of stuff. He couldn't have made that up beforehand to cover that up. She wasn't dead yet, and none of those things had happened yet. So I think that's important because I keep people say things like, well, maybe he said that because he knew her purse was in the trailer. No, you got to remember the order of things. As we always say, timelines are important. The last thing, before we get into the new stuff, the finding of the body. So we talked about this with Leo Sr., and some people seem to be confused and think that if God didn't actually tell Leo Sr. where the body was, he must be guilty, or Leo Jr. must be guilty. But that's not the point. The question is not whether God literally intervened and told Leo Sr. where the body was. It's whether it was unusual for a person in that community at that time to ascribe divine intervention to an event such as that. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, when everybody watched American Idol, including me, American Idol came to Birmingham, Alabama, And after one of the people didn't make it, they said to the judges, be careful, and left. And the judges were like, oh my goodness, he just threatened us. And then everybody was like, no, you idiots. In the South, you tell people to be careful when you leave. And so they had to issue an apology because they had accused this guy of threatening them. It's the same type of thing. If, the Lord led me to it is the kind of thing everybody said in this community, then it's less sort of suspicious that Leo Sr. would say it. It's not about whether you actually believe in God or not. That is not the point. It's about whether or not this is an unusual thing for him to say.
Great points, Brett. So much to talk about, but we said we would move through. So a couple things to address before we get back to the trial. Leroy Parker. So Parker was the lab technician who processed the car, and he found what he thought was some blood on a piece of carpet in the cargo compartment. He also found a Downy bottle with what he thought was a swipe of suspected blood on it and 4 latent fingerprints.
And the 4 latent fingerprints are going to become important later on. But at the time, they didn't match Leo and they didn't match Michelle, and nobody knew whose they were.
Hey, dun dun. Stay tuned for later.
Dun dun.
Dun dun. All right. Ed Gunther. Gunther is a crime scene analyst who processed the Schofield trailer. Now, he used luminol on the trailer. Some of you who maybe have been following true crime stories for a while know what luminol is. Now, luminol isn't as magic as some people think. It will pick up more than just blood. But it is a presumptive test for blood that was once there that's been cleaned up. Now, the luminol test was positive in the bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. But there was no mass of blood, no pattern. But there were places in the bedroom that seemed to have some blood, and there were presumptive positives on these spots. Now, this is one area where a cold transcript is really hard. The jury had diagrams and pictures they were looking at. We don't. The spots themselves are described as 2 to 3 inches square. That's really difficult to understand, except that this is not like globs of blood. Now, remember, where you live, day in, day out, where you get paper cuts, where you accidentally cut yourself while you're making food, where if you're in the bathroom, ladies, there are reasons to have blood in the bathroom that we don't have to be explicit about. You can imagine that there would be blood that's cleaned up at some point in these areas in your house. Now, what we're looking for is some sort of pattern and mass amounts of it based on the injuries that Michelle sustained. And we didn't see the mass amounts, but I think it's important to note that there were signs of blood that had been cleaned up in the bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. And I have to note, those 3 places, again, the trailer is not very big, are places that probably in my house, for example, at some point in the years I've lived here, had blood that I cleaned up. Now, Gunther noted that a carpet cleaner would give a false positive. That's really interesting because detergent is one of the things that reacts to luminol, which, just as an aside, seems like a serious defect in testing because how do most people clean up crime scenes or blood? Probably detergent or some type of soap. So if the test could have a false positive for detergent, I personally think that's interesting to note. Anyways, on cross-examination, Edmund noted, and remember, Jack Edmund is Leo's attorney, noted that things like animal urine would also react to luminol, as well as other bodily fluids, as well plant materials, vodka, horseradish, and rust.
Vodka.
That's a pretty wide-ranging list of things.
If vodka reacts, my whole house would just light up, I guess. Yeah, that's a ton of stuff. And they had a little puppy too, so I
was going to say, animal urine? That puppy probably luminoled the whole place.
Yeah, I didn't realize until this case, because I think like most of us, my experience with luminol was like CSI. I don't know about you, Alice. I've never had a case that had luminol in it. But this case, it's like, wait a second, luminol reacts to everything. I thought it was just blood.
In reading that list, when I got to horseradish, I kind of had to chuckle a little bit because I don't think that this was an exhaustive list of everything that people even know reacts to luminol. It was like someone had the misfortune of spilling their horseradish everywhere and got arrested, when the luminol test went crazy. And they're like, oh, sorry guys, put horseradish on that list now?
I love horseradish. Just had some tonight.
Horseradish.
The thing is, we joke, but really, I mean, the whole point of this is to give you another area to look, right? It's kind of like genetic genealogy. It's like a lead. So luminol lights up. It's a presumptive test. So that means this would react to blood. So there may be blood here. We need to get a confirmatory test to show whether or not it's blood, or maybe it's horseradish or vodka.
There you go. Now, interestingly, Gunther testified that the carpet did not appear that it had been cleaned any time lately. Okay, this is interesting, as it's not clear why you would need luminol to find blood from a couple days before if the blood had not actually been cleaned. Think about that for a second. If you can tell that the carpet hadn't been cleaned, then the blood would have been on there the last couple of days. So any positive from the luminol test you would think is a false positive, or from a blood cleanup that had nothing to do with the murder. Now, this is also a problem for the prosecution's theory that Leo used a carpet cleaner on the floor. The defense also noted that given the amount of blood, there should have been blood soaking through to the subsurface. Unfortunately, think about a case that we have all heard a lot about in the news, the Idaho murders. We all know that that was a very brutal stabbing of 4 people, but we had reports that the amount of blood from those horrific stab wounds leaked to the outside of the house, and the victims were on the inside of the house. Same here. If we can see these globs of blood on the dirt path next to where Michelle's body was dumped, you would imagine that amount of blood is not sitting on top of, say, dirt. It would be soaking through carpet into the subfloor where a carpet cleaner couldn't reach it. And even if it reached it, it would have stained the subfloor. But none of that was found in this instance.
And you just have to go back to the fact we're talking about a half a gallon of blood. How about 5 pints of blood? This is a lot of blood. A 2.5 liter bottle for those of you in lesser countries who use the metric system. That's a lot of blood, right? And we talked about the fact that there's no blood on Leo's clothes and how that was significant. And we're going to talk about how the prosecution dealt with that when we get a little bit further into it. But now you've got no blood on Leo's clothes, no masses of blood in the house, no blood in the subsurface. To the extent you're finding blood through luminol, it's not a lot of it in no discernible pattern, and it could be any number of other things. And you're not seeing things like cast off. Remember, she was stabbed over 20 times. So if you're stabbing someone over 20 times in that sort of trailer in that constrained area, you would expect to see blood not just on the carpet, not just bleeding from her, but getting thrown all over the place. And you're not seeing any of that. And it's interesting that there's no evidence of cleaning either. There's sort of very minor evidence, the lack of sheets, which we're also going to talk about later. But as far as actually cleaning up the blood that you would expect to see there, you're just not seeing it. And this is one of the times that I think Jack Edmonds does a pretty good job on cross-examination of pointing all this stuff out. Now, I think the problem for him and for Leo is this comes after all the evidence of abuse, after hearing from people who say they saw Leo. And I think maybe the jury had sort of already made up its mind. So they didn't really understand why you had this inconsistency, but they figured, I don't know the explanation, but there's probably an explanation for it.
And one other thing to note about that, in all of that prosecution lead up about what a bad guy he is, it at least has it set up that this is a guy who's calculated and knows what he's doing. So you can imagine the jury's already primed to think, wow, he knew how to stab her 26 times without letting blood go everywhere and be detected on a luminol test. How evil is that? You can imagine that's kind of going through their head, and that's like a side effect of having 20 witnesses testify about just how violent he is. Surely this isn't the most violent he's been. He's practiced. He's led up to this moment, is what the prosecution's trying to get the jury to think.
So after this, they have Nancy Stout, who testifies. Now, she works in forensic serology, so she works with blood. And she was given a blood sample from both Michelle Schofield and Leo to test against the various blood samples recovered from the scene. She tested the dirt from the road near where Michelle was found, and it had blood of the same type as Michelle's. Remember, this is before DNA, so we're doing blood typing. And in fact, the blood stain on the road was the most complete sample they found, including of things like Michelle's jacket and shirt, which I think is interesting. Of all the places they tested, where they found the most blood and the easiest to test was this dirt on the side of the road. Now, she found blood everywhere you would expect it. She found it on Michelle's bra, on her pants, on her jacket, on her shirt, But there was one big exception where she found no blood. There was no blood on the clothes Leo was wearing that night, either the shirt or the jeans or his shoes. Now, the prosecution, in closing, they recognize this is a problem. This is a hole for them. So they try and salvage this, noting that maybe Leo changed clothes and no one noticed. As they said, quote, if he'd been wearing a 3-piece Brooks Brothers suit, maybe it would be significant. And I think this is an example of good argumentation for the prosecution, because frankly, they got nothing as far as evidence goes. Like, they can't point to anything. They don't have anybody saying he changed his clothes or that they noticed that. So they have to sort of give the jury an out and basically say, look, okay, fine. We don't have any evidence he changed clothes, but who would notice, right? I mean, how distinctive were the shirts and the jeans he's wearing? But remember, that is just pure argument. Maybe that's true, but they don't actually have anything. They have literally no one who testifies that he changed clothes. Now, one thing that's also interesting, okay, t-shirt, whatever. Probably has a ton of t-shirts. Jeans, maybe has a few pairs of jeans. But what about his shoes? There was no blood on his shoes either. And, you know, Leo's not that rich a guy. And I just go ahead and tell you, this will just be me doing my thing where I impose my values on everybody else. As a guy, I got like one pair of tennis shoes, and that's it. I got some boots. I got some dress shoes. I got one pair of tennis shoes. And if I had to throw away my tennis shoes because they had blood all over them, I wouldn't have any other tennis shoes to change into. And you got to wonder, is Leo, who doesn't have a whole lot of money, they don't even have a phone in their trailer, does he really just have an extra pair of tennis shoes that he can change into that no one will notice so that he can get rid of the bloody shoes that he's been wearing?
So that's actually a very common tactic for law enforcement to find a perpetrator, is to look for the shoes, right? By the way, if you're ever the victim of a crime, try to look at the person's shoes to give that to the police, because oftentimes when perpetrators change their appearance, they forget to or don't change their shoes because it's the lowest part of your body. And also, we all have probably a lot more shirts, pants, jackets, what have you, than we do shoes. So people typically keep wearing their shoes even when they remember to change all of the clothes that they're wearing. And certainly in this instance, I mean, look, Leo could even point out that red jelly shoes were missing from the trailer for Michelle. Leads me to believe neither of them have like this incredibly extensive wardrobe, not a very extensive shoe collection, that someone would have been able to call out, hey man, you always wear your gray tennis shoes. Where are they? And that has not happened in this case. And just really quick, I think this is a perfect example of the difference between opening and closing arguments. We've always told you, opening is supposed to be fact-based, no argument, and then closing is when you get to argue. But it's kind of conceptually difficult to understand. This was a perfect example. In opening, prosecution would not be able to say, Leo changed his clothes, because they have no reason to believe that anyone's going to testify to that. Even though they have no evidence that he changed his clothes, they get to make an argument of that in closing, even though there's no facts backing it up. Now, it's up to the defense to then argue back. You have no facts about that.
Now, Stout would also test a Downy bottle found in the car. And this is important because it's one of the few items that has blood on it that's not just at the scene. As we said, there's not really much of any blood, and none that they can confirm. Another point, we talked about those presumptive tests of blood in the trailer. None of the confirmatory tests were able to confirm the presence of blood. So sort of an open question whether it was blood or not. But one area where there was blood was on this Downy bottle in the back of the car. And remember, the whole theory is that at some point Leo was going to put Michelle's body in the back of the car. So if he did that, maybe that's how blood got on the Downy bottle. And in fact, when she tested it, she would find blood that was consistent with Michelle's on it. The problem is, there wasn't much blood on the bottle at all. It's described as a smeary, superficial stain. There was some human blood taken from a piece of carpet in the cargo area as well, but not much and not enough to confirm. Another piece of carpet was taken from the bedroom, but as we said, all Stout could say was that it contained a possible blood stain. In fact, the only reason to think it was blood was the presumptive test that we've already talked about. Every single confirmatory test that Stout tried on the blood was negative. Though, if you ever read the court opinions in this case, I found this disappointing because I like to trust court opinions. they will tell you that Michelle's blood was found in the trailer, even though when you read the actual trial transcript, beyond the presumptive test, there's no confirmation of that. The only blood we have is this blood on the Downy bottle. Now, it's still important because if you can't figure out a way to show how that superficial swipe of blood got on the Downy bottle, then it makes it feel more like maybe her body was transported in the back of the car. How it's possible that's the only place with blood, hard to say, but nevertheless, it is something you have to address if you think Leo is innocent. We will talk more about it later. As far as Leo's blood, none was found. Now, why is that important? We talked about it before. You stab somebody, stabbing people's hard. When you stab somebody 20-something times in a frenzy, the knife's going to slip. And a lot of times, what you see in stabbing cases is the people who do the stabbing have cuts on their hands. Most times in stabbing cases, maybe not most times, but a lot of times, you'll find blood from the actual person. We don't find any of Leo's blood. Now, look, we don't find, at least that they tested, anybody else's either. So whoever stabbed her, it seems like they probably didn't bleed, but certainly Leo, if he did this, managed to do it without cutting himself.
Absolutely. We haven't even gotten to what we wanted to talk about.
We're moving through.
We'll move through. Okay, Robert Weeks. Now, Weeks was the lead investigator in the case. He described the area where Michelle's body was found as a lover's lane, a place where people would go to at night and park. He also knew of people using the area to fish, and he testified that there were drag marks from the center area of the dirt road to where the body would be found. That is actually consistent with a car going there, right? If you're driving down a dirt road, your car's probably in the middle of the road, probably not to the side, which would make sense that if you're in the middle of the road, dragging a body from kind of that area to where she was ultimately dumped. Weeks helped to do the search of the Schofield home. Now, he noted that when they entered the bedroom, one of the first things he noticed that was out of place was that there were no sheets on their bed. Instead, there were photographs all over the bed. Leo explained it that they didn't use sheets, they just used blankets. And the reason was this was a waterbed, and the sheets for waterbeds are expensive. So they didn't have the money to spend on it. So all they did was sleep on the waterbed with the blankets. Whatever the case, it's often said that the Schofields prevented Weeks from seeing the bedroom that day, but we actually know that's not true. Rather, initially, Leo Sr. didn't want law enforcement to search the trailer. He was angry at them and felt that they were lying to him and his son. So he told them that if they moved faster, Michelle would be alive. But after that initial kind of anger at the police and not wanting them to search it, he relented. And the police, Weeks, actually did search the trailer that first day.
So I know that we're trying to move quickly. But did you ever have a waterbed, Alice?
I didn't have one, but I'm trying to remember where in my life I've definitely been on a waterbed, and I don't know whose.
I had a friend who had a waterbed. But I've never had one. That was talk about a relic of the 80s. I feel like we don't do waterbeds anymore. I mean, maybe we do. But
I feel like I would just be waiting for it to explode under me.
Exactly.
I want to say I was a kid, and someone's parents probably had waterbeds, and we just loved racing across it because you can't run very fast, you know?
Yeah.
You're right. I don't think I've seen a waterbed in several decades.
I need a waterbed and a grandfather clock. Anyways, please continue.
Let's continue. So, when Weeks came to search the trailer, he also walked around the neighborhood and he talked to people, including Alice Scott. Now, Scott's statement said that she'd seen Michelle get back to the trailer around 1:30 in the morning the day of her death. This information led Weeks to view Leo as a suspect. Weeks also drove the route that Leo went the night Michelle went missing. The purpose was not to show that he couldn't make it, but rather to show it wouldn't take all that much time to do that route. Now, this presumably would leave Leo time to kill Michelle and dispose of her body. It would also leave him time to look for her, or make it look like he's looking for her, and build an alibi, which is what he was saying he was doing. Now, Weeks testified that he did not believe the murder site and the dump site were the same. He did not believe there was evidence of a struggle at the scene. Leo was remarkably forthcoming with the police in his statement. He admitted to slapping Michelle, and he told them that when he called the sheriff to look for Michelle, he was so angry with her that he told his buddy if she walked through the door at that moment, he could kill her. And by the way, like, the fact that he says it himself, read into it what you have, but it doesn't seem like he's shying away from his anger in that night. Terrible time to say you want to kill your wife the night that she actually ends up dead. Or was he so angry he could have killed her? Whatever it is, he actually says it himself, that he recognizes that he was that angry at her and said those words.
And look, I'm not going to say that behavioral analysis, statement analysis is worthless, but I think unless you're somebody who's an expert in it, like a trained expert, it's probably a fool's errand to engage in it. When I hear this, my thought just as a person is, would you really say that if you had killed her? Would you really admit how angry you were if you had also killed her? Wouldn't you try and cover that up? Wouldn't you try and pull back on that? Limit it, minimize it. I think that's what you would do, but I don't know. Maybe he's clever. As we've said before, maybe he tells the truth right up to the point of when he killed her. So he's telling as much truth as he can so people believe him. And that's the problem I have often with this sort of, this kind of stuff is I don't know if the person is being clever or if they're actually giving something away. And I think it's really hard to tell, particularly if you're not an expert.
Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
That brings us to someone that we have mentioned 1,000 times, but have not actually gotten into detail on. Alice Scott. And Alice Scott is, in many ways, the key to this entire case. So of all the testimony in the trial, Alice Scott's might have been the most damning for Leo. So she was Leo's next-door neighbor. Despite that, she never spoke to Leo or Michelle until after the murder. But she was the epitome of the nosy neighbor and watched them very closely. In fact, she was such the epitome of the nosy neighbor that in the opening statement, the prosecutor actually describes her as that. Now, she recounted much of the same testimony as others about seeing Leo abuse Michelle. She testified that the last time she saw Michelle and Leo together, it was at night. She heard a noise and went into her bathroom so she could look out the bathroom window. She saw Leo and Michelle getting out of their car, that orange Mazda we've talked about, usually called a Nissan, but it's a Mazda. She said it was around 1 or 1:30. If Alice is right, it would have been more like 1:30, as Leo didn't leave Vince's house until 1:15 a.m., and we have that from multiple people who say that was the case. She said that she saw
and remember,
Leo.
No one at Vince's saw Michelle. So
Right.
That's a pretty short timeline.
No one at Vince's saw Michelle, and half the people at Vince's ended up testifying against Leo. So that's another reason I think we can probably believe they're not, constructing some sort of alibi for him. So they go into the trailer, and Alice waited. Now remember, this is like a little sort of gravel road here in between Alice's trailer and Leo's. And she says at some point she could hear screaming, "No, Leo, don't. In what sounded like Leo pushing Michelle against the wall. Approximately 20 minutes later, Leo comes out of the trailer. He gets in the car and drives off. Now note, he's not carrying anything. He doesn't have a body. He just gets out and drives off. So Alice just hangs out in the bathroom, apparently. And at some point later, unclear how long passed, Alice, who's still awake, still watching, sees Leo pull back up in his vehicle. But this time, he parks the car in front of his trailer with sort of the hatchback backed up towards the door. He opens the hatchback. He then goes into the trailer and he comes out with something in his hands. It was covered up, so she couldn't see what it was. And she didn't really know what it was covered with either. All she knew, it was big, and it looked like it was heavy. Now, she observed all this, according to her testimony, sitting on her bathroom counter, looking out the bathroom window. At that point, as she's watching Leo carry this thing out of his trailer, she sees her sister-in-law coming home from work. This is Linda Sales. She says at this point, she actually goes outside to the fence that separates their yards and speaks to her sister-in-law, Linda Sales, about seeing all of this and Leo carrying this thing out and how it's very strange. So that's her testimony about what happened that night. She says that at 10 a.m. the next morning, she sees Leo standing in the doorway of his trailer. At this point, she goes to a doctor's appointment, and when she comes back, Leo is in his trailer cleaning his carpet with a carpet cleaner. And he's just left the door open, and that's how she can see this. Now, remarkably, Alice didn't mention this detail to the police when they initially spoke to her, despite all but accusing Leo of murder in that statement. She tells him everything else that we mentioned. She doesn't mention the carpet cleaner. Actually, she would testify that she did tell the police this, but they didn't write it down. No way that's true. Police officer would absolutely write down murder suspect was cleaning trailer. So she clearly did not tell them. On cross-examination, she will say that she mentioned it in John Aguero's office. But there's a police report from this meeting as well, and it also doesn't mention the carpet cleaner. So Alice must have told Aguero this in a private meeting that wasn't recorded, or she's not being truthful about telling it to him at all. Now, in cross-examination, Jack Edmond will bring out that Alice did not tell the police about Linda Sales. And during this cross-examination, her memory suddenly becomes fuzzy. When pressed on what day she saw this event, she'll say she can't really remember dates. In fact, on multiple occasions, she will tell Jack Edmond that she can't remember dates. It's something she comes back to again and again. And Edmond will also bring up the time discrepancy that we mentioned way back in the timeline. So initially, Scott told police that Leo left the house carrying the large object between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. But now she alternately doesn't remember how long he was in the house or says that he was only there for a few minutes, no more than 10. Edmonds points out that she has to say this because she has learned in the interim that Leo was visiting David Somm at 2:30. So her initial timeline can't work.
So really quick about Alice Scott. I know we spent a lot of time talking about her. I think this is really interesting to note because we've talked about how her story changes or how much can you believe her. But from the jury's perspective, when they're hearing her testify to this, you can imagine how believable this all sounds because of where she says she sees everything that night. She says the bathroom counter. So I'm putting myself in court. If I'm hearing this testimony come out, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this person really is seeing all of this because this is not some accidental viewing where the view of the Schofield's trailer is, say, out of the corner of her eye or even a direct shot from the recliner she always sits in to watch TV. So she's watching TV all night. And of course, she glances over every time they come over or have a fight because it's just within her line of vision. But she's actually going about her normal life and you can't help but notice things right in front of you. No. What she's saying is she moves herself into her bathroom and sits on her bathroom counter, which can't be a very comfortable place to sit, right? If you're perched up on a counter, there's usually no back to it. You're leaning against the wall. It's cold. It's hard. You're probably halfway sitting into a sink. Things are sticking into you because I don't know how big your bathroom counter is, but it's not made for sitting. And if you're sitting there waiting for someone to come back, that could be, as we know from the timeline of driving around, it's not 5 or 10 minutes. We're talking about an indefinite amount of time committed to kind of seeing this through, watching, which brings up lots of questions. But I note that because the way she's testifying is not saying, I think I saw something. It's saying, I know I saw this because I stood there and watched it with all the attention in the world. We'll see how much we can trust this. Now, I know that Edmund has gotten some kind of flack over the years about not being a good attorney, or maybe, he wasn't the best choice. I will say the questions he asks on cross here, I think are very effective. But it is really hard as a defendant charged with murder to overcome an eyewitness who basically says they see everything happening other than the knife going into the body. So he does have a lot to face in terms of cross-examining her, and he does pull off a bit of a coup. He gets Alice to completely change her story on cross-examination. Initially, she testified that the screaming was after she saw Leo and Michelle enter the home the first time. Then Leo left, then he came back, removed the heavy object, and left again. We all heard that, right? Sounds really bad. You can absolutely see that playing out if Leo was guilty. But on cross, Scott testifies that in fact she heard Michelle screaming for 10 minutes after Leo came back the second time. Then 10 minutes later, Leo came out carrying the object. Edmund also notes that there was no light shining on the area of the porch where Alice says she saw Leo carrying the object out. And why is that important? How can she see it if we're talking about 1, 2 a.m., sometime in the middle of the night when there's darkness and it's completely dark, where she says she sees something incredibly important for the prosecution's theory? Now, what's interesting about Alice's changed story is that it goes back to the initial story she told police, the one that doesn't really fit the evidence. In that story, Leo and Michelle arrived between 1:30 and 2, and Leo let Michelle out of the car and then drove off. 30 minutes later, he's back. And then Alice heard the screaming and the beating. 30 minutes after that, between 2:30 and 3, she sees Leo carrying the large object out. But as we've noted, this story makes no sense and does not fit with known points in the timeline. That Alice changed her story to better fit the timeline for the purposes of the trial seems pretty obvious when you see what she testified on direct versus what she first told police, and then what she said when she was pushed on cross-examination. But it is interesting that she falls back into a version of her original story when pressed. All in all, this really was one of the more effective cross-examinations that I think we've seen in one of these types of cases. Scott doesn't waver on the key points, though. The screaming and the carrying of the object, even if she can't say for certain it happened on the night of the murder. But if Leo left Michelle there and drove off for some period of time, as Alice said, why is Michelle still wearing her jacket? Why is she still wearing her work clothes? She would have had time, because Leo would have driven off in her story and taken off, probably gotten ready for bed, you would think, at this late hour. But we don't see that. And if this was a rage-induced murder, then doesn't Alice's original story make more sense? They're in the heat of the moment. They get out of the car. They're screaming. Michelle had been late. Finally, he finds her. They're mad. They're screaming. And he kills her then. But if her second story is what she falls back on, that doesn't seem to be rage-induced at all. Because let's say Leo was really mad, but he drove off for 30 minutes and had time to cool off before he came back. You don't typically cool off when you're about to rage kill. So if Leo killed Michelle and left her in the trailer and then came back, where's the blood? Because Michelle would have been bleeding out for 30 minutes while Leo went out, doing who knows what, maybe getting materials to clean all the blood. But certainly that blood that we definitely see on the dirt road next to where her body was found, that amount of blood you would think would also be in the trailer, seeping down to, say, the subfloor, seeping down to, say, the mattress, even if there was a sheet on it, and all the more easy to see bloodstains on a waterbed, by the way, if there's no sheets on it. But we don't see any of that. We know we don't see that amount of blood in the trailer. As for Leo, he would testify he often carried a large amplifier out of his house. Remember, he is in a rock and roll band. And amplifiers, if you have one, you know that they're pretty big and bulky, so it's not easy to carry them around. And he would put it in the back of his car. So could it be possible that Alice Scott has seen them fight a lot and a lot of screaming, maybe even beating? Things that Leo has admitted to on the stand, that he has hit Michelle before. And she has seen him carry out something large and bulky and put it into the back of his car at another time. Is she conflating two different times? Or did she really see Leo kill Michelle and carry her body from the trailer into his car?
And when you initially hear Alice Scott's testimony, it's like, we have a direct witness of this. She not only sees him carrying something out of the house the night that Michelle disappears, she basically hears him murder her. She hears Michelle scream out, "No, Leo, no." It's almost too perfect, right? I mean, it kind of reminds me of sort of Acid is Groovy, Kill the Pigs or something. I mean, it's so perfect, her memory of this. But then when you really start to think about it, it's like, how does this make sense? And Alice pointed out a bunch of the problems with it. You know, if he's going off and coming back, is he still so rage-filled that he's going to murder her? Because that's a thing that really grabs people, is this is a rage murder, 20-something stab wounds. I mean, this is rage. The kind of rage that, you know, some people say you only see when you love somebody. You only see that kind of hate when you love somebody, right? And I think that really grabs onto people, and we've heard that in feedback. People have said things like, stab somebody that much time. That seems like the husband, enraged. But if he drove off for 30 minutes, was he really that enraged when he got back? And if he killed her initially, where's all the blood? The other problem, the knife. The presumption in this case is that the knife was the equalizer. Remember that from the car? A knife he kept in the car. When did he get the knife out of the car? Did he take the knife with him when he initially takes Michelle into the house? You would think Alice Scott, if she saw him dragging her up the stairs with one hand by the hair and with a pretty large knife in his other hand, she would have mentioned that. Did he come back 30 minutes later when he decided to murder her, and this was a conscious decision, and so he decides to take the knife with him into the house? No murder weapon has ever been discovered. The police don't mention any, knives missing from the knife block or anything. The presumption is this purely hearsay evidence we talked about earlier of this equalizer in the car, that's the knife that he used. But when did he get it? And I just feel like so much of Alice Scott's story, when you first see it, it's like, wow, that's powerful. But then the more you think about it, the more the whole thing kind of starts to fall apart.
That's a really great point about the equalizer, the knife being in the car, because if the first story that she told is true, that the Schofields got home and went into the trailer and started yelling, if it were a rage-induced killing, which 26 stab wounds certainly sounds like something like that, immense hate or immense rage, that you would have had to think that he had planned to kill her all along. So where was that rage? Was it in the car? Why didn't he stab her in the car? So he knew he was going to kill her, maybe brought the knife in with him. They continued to fight for 10, 20 minutes before he decided to then take out the knife and start stabbing her. Or he didn't know he was going to kill her. So they get home, they're angry, they get inside, they're fighting. It escalates to a point where he's like, I'm going to kill you. My only weapon is in the car. You would think that Alice Scott, who's sitting on her bathroom counter, sees everything happening, would maybe hear the door slam to the trailer as he's run into his car, grab his knife, run back in. No, Leo, don't. Stab her 26 times, then the rest of the story. But we don't have that. So I think it's really interesting that the only potential piece of evidence for the murder weapon would be in the car. By the way, we don't know for a fact that he had a knife in his car. This is all very interesting, especially because she remembers some parts so clearly. Obviously, it changes on cross-examination. But there are problems even with her best story.
And the problems with Alice Scott go beyond just her testimony. Scott has other issues, and she might not have been all that credible, regardless of what she actually testified to. So we know now that Alice struggled with mental health issues. She had been involuntarily committed, with her delusions resulting in a stint at a mental health institution. Remember how she said she looked out her bathroom window and saw Leo carrying something out of the house? Well, her ex-husband, Ricky, says that was impossible. In an interview with the Tampa Bay Times, he said, "I was with her in our trailer when she said she saw Leo arrive home with Michelle, carrying something out to the car that was supposed to be her body. And I didn't believe Alice," he says. "I know how she twisted the truth." In fact, he told the Times, no way Alice could have seen and heard from that little bathroom window what she said she heard and saw at Schofield's that night. She took a little something and exaggerated it like she always did. And so Alice was confronted by these statements and by the fact that she could not have seen and heard what she said she did from that bathroom window. So she changed her story and said she'd actually gone outside onto the screened-in porch to watch. And Alice told a reporter, and make of this what you will, if Aguero had done what he was supposed to and executed Leo Schofield, she says, we wouldn't have to be dealing with this mess now. And it's pretty obvious that Alice Scott has a habit of at least severe embellishment. And her initial statement to the police, she said Leo would beat Michelle day and night. She said that when Michelle would get home from work, Leo would run out of the trailer and grab Michelle by the hair and beat her while dragging her into the trailer. She said that for the week before she went missing, Leo would drop off Michelle at the trailer around midnight, then come back and beat her. Even the most extreme testimony about Leo from people who really didn't like Leo didn't say he was that violent. Nowhere near as violent as what Alice Scott would say. Linda Sales, who's another witness we've mentioned several times and we're about to talk about more, spoke to police on March 2nd. During this initial statement, she didn't have much to add, but she did mention Alice Scott. Scott told her that someone named Dean, who lived next to Leo and Michelle, quote, heard a noise at the victim's trailer that night or Wednesday morning. That's it. Is it even possible that if Alice had seen everything she claimed to see, that she would have kept it to herself, that she wouldn't have told her sister-in-law across the fence, "You'll never believe what I saw tonight"? Or did Alice hear what Dean had to say and then put herself into the middle of this story and spin it into something much more than it ever was?
So I think what her ex-husband Ricky has to say kind of illuminates everything about Alice Scott, puts a new dimension on it that maybe we didn't really see before, especially the perhaps mental illness aspect of it. Because what she says is direct eyewitness, right? It's hard to believe, at least we never want to believe in the first instance, that someone is just making up something whole cloth. Okay, so you're thinking, wait, Alice Scott says she told Linda Sells what happened. So, of course, we have to hear from Linda Sells, and we do. Now, Linda was Scott's next-door neighbor and her sister-in-law. She had a job cleaning banks at night and usually got off around 2 or 3 a.m. One day, Sells said she got off early and she came home between 1 and 1:30, and that's when she saw Leo carrying something out of his house to the back of his car. But on cross-examination, Linda said this event was a week or two before she spoke to the police. The police interviewed her on Saturday, February 28th. Now, Jack Edmond keeps calling it Saturday, March 2nd, which does not help because it pushes it out a week. But note that the records actually say February 28th. Now, Michelle disappeared on the prior Tuesday, February 24th. So the timing doesn't quite work out for what if Linda got off early enough to see the murder taking place or have seen Michelle's body being carried out. So, as is probably no surprise to anyone at this point, when initially interviewed, Linda told the police that all she saw that night was a light on in the trailer. In fact, she said nothing about talking to Alice Scott that night. When she was asked what people the police should talk to, she did not mention Alice. She would also tell police she saw a 4-door Caprice parked at the trailer that night. No one ever could figure out what car that was supposed to be. It makes sense that Linda initially wouldn't be that helpful to police. And by the way, of course, sometimes people just don't tell the police all the information they know. But if Alice Scott had told Linda Sells everything she saw, everything she testified to, you would think that when asked, is there anyone we should talk to about what may have happened, Linda would have said 5 days later, talk to Alice Scott, who's the Schofield's next door neighbor. But nothing like that happened at the time. By the way, this is why we always say it's incredibly important to talk to witnesses as close to the time of the event as possible, because memories fade, but also people talk and stories may change, not even in a pernicious way, but because we are all influenceable. Now, despite what Alice Scott said about Linda coming home the night Michelle was killed and seeing something, Linda did not work at all that night, which would mean that the night Linda refers to in her testimony when she came home early from work and saw Leo carrying something out was the same night that she talked to Alice Scott. Would have been a different night from the one which Michelle was killed.
Which is kind of a big deal.
So in other words, Linda Sells is a bunch of nothing in terms of actual evidence that pins Leo to what Alice Scott is saying.
And can I just say, I don't ever want to hear anyone talk about how a case is merely circumstantial again. Oh, we're the eyewitnesses. We need direct evidence. Look, witnesses are great. We put witnesses on the stand all the time. But if they're not backed up by something, they're basically worthless. I mean, people just get so much stuff wrong. And they remember things so poorly. Particularly, I mean, it's one thing when the next day the witness talks to the police and they tell them something. And then on the stand, they say the same thing. Okay. You know, what's crazy about this case is you have all these people who are critical witnesses who the first time they talk to the police, the first couple times they talk to the police, they don't tell them any of this stuff. And then like a year later, or a year and a half later, all of a sudden they're remembering all these details. Now I'll say this, Alice Scott from the very beginning told the police this whole screaming thing and the driving off and the coming back and the driving off again. Alice Scott is consistent from the first time she talks to the police. I mean, she's not consistent, as we just pointed out, but at least the sort of general story, you know, her initial statement to the police wasn't, I didn't see anything. She at least said that. But the LaFoons, Linda Sells, they're initially like, they didn't see anything. They don't mention any of this stuff. They don't mention Alice. I mean, the fact that Linda Sells doesn't mention Alice when they talk to her sister-in-law, who supposedly she talked to that night, it's kind of mind-blowing, right? And it's just like, how much can you trust these people?
It's interesting that both the LaFoons and Linda Sells have this new story after speaking to who? Alice Scott.
Alice Scott, exactly. Alice Scott is the key to everything. She's the linchpin to all of this. If you believe Alice Scott, then Leo's guilty. If you have doubts about Alice Scott, then you kind of have to have doubts about everybody else. And look, we're not trying to sandbag you here and just undermine Alice Scott. This is just her testimony. And this is just who she is, right? And
this is a bad cross-examination. Like for both Linda Sells and for Alice Scott and the LaFoons. If I'm the prosecutor and they are my witnesses, my hand is in my head and I'm like, there goes our case. Like other than the fact that he's a terrible human being, so far all the evidence we have tying him to the murder is being demolished on cross-examination.
And look, we talk about 404B evidence and 404A and why bad character evidence is kept out. And we talked about this when we talked about the Michael Peterson case. Why that evidence shouldn't come in. I'm not saying this wasn't admissible. I do think there's some 403 arguments for why she keep some of it out. But I have no doubt in my mind that Leo was already convicted by this point. That by the time those jurors heard all that evidence about him beating her, they were done. And to a certain extent, I get that. I mean, if I'd heard that, I would have been enraged towards him too. I'd have been very angry at him. And that's why that evidence has to be handled so delicately, because it is human nature to hear that and just be mad and think that guy is a violent SOB and he probably killed that girl and I'm going to get her justice.
And another thing, the LaFoons, Linda Sells, and Alice Scott probably all felt that way about Leo as well, right? They all lived in very close proximity to them, and they probably didn't have the highest opinion of Leo to begin with. And so a lot of people are thinking, why would Alice Scott be able to change other people's minds? They may not know that their minds are being changed. They may be, you know how when you have someone who just like wants to just keep beating, you know, a point, and they're like, but remember when he did this? Remember he did this? And I can imagine she never stops talking about it. You know why I know that? Because she never stops talking about it to the police. I mean, she literally never stops talking about this event to the police over and over. You have her literally ushering in the LaFoons to the police to be interviewed. She is with them. She is with them when they are interviewed. And it's not necessarily that they are being manipulated by her or even pressured by her, but when someone is in your ear at all times and they are related to you, they live next to you and you see them all the time. I don't know if you guys have had these experiences before, but that amount of pressure at all times does begin to shape your memory of what happened. Well, I did see him carry something out. I don't remember when it was, but if you're telling me that you saw it too, well then two of us can't be wrong. Yeah, okay, I probably saw him that night. Oh my gosh, I saw him carry out Michelle. I have to go tell the police. This is horrible. I can't believe I saw this and I didn't even realize what I saw. Let's go talk to them right now. You can see how that can happen pretty quickly. And those of you thinking that would never happen to me, we see it happen a lot. I see this happen so often by smart people who have degrees, who are working professionals, who I see their memories getting shaped and swayed by other evidence they're seeing or by people they've talked to. Because you remember, you're not banned from talking to other witnesses if it's before trial, if this is just an investigation, because we can't keep you from your First Amendment rights to not speak to people. And guess what people always do? They call each other and they're like, hey, do you remember doing this? And we try to warn witnesses not to do that before a trial, but they never listen to us. And we're not going to do gag orders and all that stuff because you have, rights to talk to people. And so this happens a lot. And I can see how this happened with both Linda Sells and the LaFoons without the LaFoons or Linda Sells trying to lie about this.
I can see Linda Sells a lot easier than the LaFoons. I'm not sure what's going on with the LaFoons, but and look, what Alice is saying, if you don't believe it, and you don't believe you're susceptible to it, you're lying to yourself. You absolutely are. Like there has to have been a situation in your life where someone convinced you to doubt something or to believe something that you intuitively knew wasn't true. And I remember an example of this for me. I was at a party once and we were watching football. And somehow we got to talking about holding in the end zone. Like if you have the ball and there's holding in the end zone. And I was like, yeah, it's a safety. And everybody else at the was absolutely convinced that I was wrong about this. And this was before Google, so I couldn't just Google it. I mean, they just thought it was the craziest thing they'd ever heard. Like, what are you talking about? You get a penalty in the end zone, you're going to get points? That's absurd. That's not what's going to happen. And they were so sure that I started to doubt it myself. Like at one point, one of them bet me a keg of beer that I was wrong. And I was like, I'm not going to take that bet because at that point I was doubting myself, right? Well, I wish I had taken the bet because obviously I was right. But it is so easy when other people are telling you something to start to shift your view. And you could imagine Linda Sells, you could imagine Alice Scott saying something like, don't you remember that night you got off work early? You saw Leo carrying that. Don't you remember? That was the night she disappeared. And Linda being like, oh, wow, was it? It was that night? Well, yeah, I remember that, right? And then Linda buys in completely because she remembers that night she got home early and saw Leo, carrying an amplifier out, if that's what it was, to his car. Like she remembers that. And so from that point forward, she believes that's true. And maybe later on, you point out to her, you didn't actually work the night that Michelle went missing. And then all of a sudden she's like, oh, shoot. But not when she's hearing Alice Scott tell her that. And not when Jack Edmonds not looking into this. This is the other problem with Jack Edmonds. He was obviously, he's not investigating. He's obviously a very talented lawyer.
He's cross-examining, but he's not investigating because, in Bone Valley, they say something about Jack Edmond. He's the lawyer you want if you're guilty. He's not the lawyer you want if you're innocent. And what they're trying to say there is that if you're innocent, you need someone to be investigating for you because they need to figure out the other story, who actually did it or why you couldn't do it. Because the prosecution is not looking for that story. So they're not actively investigating an alibi for you because they think you did it. That's why they're prosecuting you. So it's up to the defense to do that. By the way, that's why defense counsel may not want speedy trial. You know, as we're talking about speedy trial in the news and other cases, people have said, when would a defendant not want speedy trial? And it's often in these situations, not only to digest the amount of information that's being turned over in discovery, but once you have that discovery, to then do your own investigation to be able to tell the story as to why you're innocent or why someone else did it. And that's not what he does. First of all, he's probably too busy. That's not what he does. He relies on his wit and charm in a jury trial, because that's a lot of what jury trials is getting the jurors to like you and to poke holes in the witnesses' testimony, which he does incredibly effectively. But when there's those holes, there's nothing to fill them with in this instance. And for Leo, we really needed those holes filled with something. And unfortunately, Jack Edmond didn't have anything to fill them with. One thing about the LaFoons, the reason I can see the LaFoons do that is the LaFoons talked to the police with the news story, 18 months later? Imagine being told something for 18 months. I don't remember anything from last week. If you tried to tell me last month, Brett, that we definitely went to some restaurant we never went to before, and you told me for 18 months straight, by 18 months later, I'm like, yeah, that probably happened. I have no idea anymore. And so that's why I can see that happening to the LaFoons. They live very close to Alice Scott. If she does have this tendency to exaggerate everything, it's probably a very intense personality to live next to. And if she's hounding them every day for 18 months to go talk to the police, at some point, because I live so close to you, I might just be like, okay, yeah, I do remember that. Let's go talk to the police. So while it's a little bit stranger that there's two of them and they would go tell the police something that seems to crumble on cross-examination, I can see that because of who we are beginning to see Alice Scott is.
So we'll probably talk about her some more as we continue on, but let's leave Alice Scott behind for now and talk about Kristen Schofield. We talked about her some when we talked about the timeline, and if you believe her, she's really important witness. If she's right and she's telling the truth, it's basically impossible for Leo to have committed the murder because she confirms that Leo was at his parents' house at various times that he would have needed to have been there if he's innocent. And in fact, her testimony basically eliminates any opportunity for Leo to have killed Michelle at all. So the prosecution on cross-examination is really tough on her. And they focused on the fact that Kristen had never told the police what she saw. She says because they didn't really ever interview her. Points out that she had no intention of testifying until she was told by the defense during trial that Leo needed her. And this is the prosecution's way of undermining what she's saying. And they also attack her times and say, look, could you really remember the times from 2 years ago as specifically as you did? So essentially what they do is what we've been doing with various other witnesses. They say, look, you didn't tell us this initially. This is a recently developed story. How could you remember these times as well as you do? She says she has reasons, but still, how would you remember this? Even if you heard the gong clock, even if you looked at the clock on the microwave, would you really remember those times? And if you knew this, why would the defense not always have you on the list? Why are you just now coming in? And this brings up something we always talk about. When your alibi is your family, it is inherently weak because everyone believes, and it is probably usually true, that family members will lie for other family members, particularly when their life is on the line.
I will have to say, this cross-examination was also effective, right? Like when you find out, oh, you're kind of late added to the list, you're his sister, and you remember specific times that just happened to make it impossible for Leo to be the perpetrator here, but you remember 2 years later. Even though we never interviewed you about it before, you weren't able to give these times before, you didn't write them down at the time, you're saying this is all from your memory 2 years later, you can see how there's obviously there's that implicit bias already. It's her brother. She doesn't want her brother, of course, to be convicted. Not that she's lying here, but maybe selective memory to help out her brother, where she's followed the investigation in the case for the whole 2 years. She's been intimately aware of everything that's going on, unlike maybe a third-party witness who is unrelated to the case and are not kept up to date on all of the developments. You would think that a sister probably is following along everything that's developing in the investigation, enough for her to be able to fit her timeline perfectly to thwart whatever the prosecution's theory is. Okay, a big piece of evidence comes out during trial, and that's fingerprints. when the police checked the car for fingerprints, they found something interesting. There weren't many. They found none of Leo's at all, none of Michelle's. Now, this is interesting because we know that this car belongs to both Leo and Michelle, and they both drive it. We know that Michelle, at least, was definitely driving it that night, and it is strange that neither of their fingerprints are found on the car. But it isn't terribly unusual to find fewer fingerprints than no one expects. For instance, only 12% of firearms that are tested reveal fingerprints, but most of the firearms that we find and prosecute related to a crime were held by somebody. So it's not that only 12% of guns are held by somebody. It's that they're all held and only 12% of the tests reveal some sort of fingerprints. But cars can't, and we've talked about this, why firearms are difficult to test for fingerprints. They're usually ridged. If you can imagine like the handle of a gun, it's usually ridged, which is not the greatest surface for catching clean fingerprints and testable fingerprints. Now, cars can be equally difficult to test, but it is unusual to find absolutely no fingerprints. What you'd expect is fewer fingerprints than you would expect, but not no fingerprints, because that indicates someone wiped the car down to remove fingerprints, to cover up whatever was happening. But we know they didn't do a perfect job because 2 sets of fingerprints from the same person were found, and they matched no one known to the case. They're not Michelle's, and they're not Leo's. And they're not Leo Sr.'s, which is also interesting. Now, one set was on the windshield of the car, and the other was found in the hatchback area where the bottle with the blood swipe was also found. But this was 1987, and the ability to simply enter the fingerprints into a database and get an answer back was far less available back then than it is today. And to the extent police could have compared the fingerprints to known criminals in the area, well, no one bothered to try to find out whose fingerprints these were. So, at trial, all we know are there are 2 sets of fingerprints, and we don't know who they belong to.
Now, as we've said many times, in many of our cases, just because you find fingerprints that are unknown or DNA that's unknown, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, because there are fingerprints and DNA all over the place that are unknown that aren't necessarily related to the crime. What's interesting about this, though, is this fits more with something we also see, which is people wiping down a car after a crime and leaving 1 or 2 fingerprints. This is my, I often give PSAs to criminals. And so in addition to, use the back of the axe, to kill somebody with and various other things that I've talked about in the past, if you murder somebody, don't wipe down the car. Don't wipe down the area, because all you're going to do is highlight your fingerprints, which will be the only ones left, because you will mess up at some point. So don't do that. And you see that in a lot of cases. So the fact that these are literally the only fingerprints you see makes you feel like this isn't just some mechanics, right? That maybe this actually has something to do with the case. And spoiler alert, in the next episode, we're going to talk a lot more about these fingerprints. But for now, let's continue with this. We are almost finished. And the last thing we want to talk about is the prosecutor in this case, John Aguero. Now, John Aguero is the clear villain in Bone Valley. If you've listened to it, he is definitely the guy that nobody likes. He was a very effective prosecutor. A lot of people have very positive things to say about him, and he was somebody who I think really wanted to get justice for the victims that he prosecuted on behalf of. The problem with that is sometimes it can lead to not only tunnel vision, but maybe some shady activity. And there are a few things that he is accused of in this case that are really troubling. The first one is something that Leo says happened. He says that just before the trial, Aguero came to talk to him in the jail, doing so without his attorney. To make matters even worse, during this conversation, Aguero told him he didn't think he'd killed Michelle, that in fact, he thought Leo Sr. had done it, and that if Leo Jr. would testify against his father, he would cut him a deal that basically would get him off with no jail time. And Leo says he sent him packing. It is hard to overstate how much of a no-no this is. You can't do this.
I believe from Bone Valley, we don't have other proof other than Leo saying this happened. Yes, if this happened, this is absolutely no-no. All of you who've ever watched any police shows know that you can ask for an attorney and you have to get an attorney. Leo didn't have to ask for an attorney because he had an attorney. So once you're represented, the prosecutor and law enforcement cannot talk to you without your attorney. You don't have to ask for it every single time. You can imagine the layperson would just forget to ask for their attorney if the prosecutor comes to visit them. So once you're represented, we never, ever speak directly to the person who's represented. We only speak through their attorney, speak to the attorney. And I don't even understand, I can't imagine a world where this would be okay. If someone heard about it, that's absolutely a bar complaint. This is a potential, there would be ramifications likely on your career and also in that particular case if this happened. Now, the conversation he has does not stand out to me in terms of the big no-no. I think a lot of people, because of the potential malfeasance by Aguero, if he were to have spoken to Leo without his attorney, which is absolutely terrible, bad, bad, bad. But if there was a proper conversation with Leo, with his attorney, at some point where he made this offer, that in and of itself is not a bad thing. I can absolutely see him making this offer. It better have been with his attorney. And the reason is you're always trying to break each other, right? It may have been a tactic to try and catch Leo Jr. in a lie. He may have really thought Leo Sr. did it. I don't know if he did or not, but I can see him making this offer, whether or not he thought Leo Sr. did it, just to test what Leo Jr. believed. We've talked about this with the best use case for lie detector tests is not to really see if you fail or pass a lie detector test, but it's for the time leading up to it and right after the test where the investigator doing the questioning can say, you really want to go through this? Because I know what I'm going to find. I'm going to find that you lie, and then I'm going to have a record of it, and you're going to go down. So do you want to talk to me now, or do we have to take this test and watch you fail? And then after you do it, they can lie to you and tell you failed and see if you break. These are all interview tactics.
Here's the thing. I 100% believe he did this. I absolutely think he went and saw Leo. I don't think Leo's making that up. He shouldn't have done that. I mean, there's no excuse for that. I'm not going to say he shouldn't have done that, but there's no but here. You cannot talk to someone without their lawyer. You really shouldn't talk to witnesses without an agent or an officer in the room either, because that makes you a witness, which is going to happen later on, by the way. Aguero is going to end up a witness in this case because of doing something like this. So I think he absolutely did this. And I just don't have any question about it in my mind. The other thing that happened on the other side is Jack Edmonds apparently got a plea deal offer from John Aguero and just never shared it with Leo and rejected it. And Leo, if Leo would just say, Leo keeps saying, well, I want to take it anyway, which is the wrong thing to say, because if your attorney doesn't tell you about a plea offer and you might take it, guess what? Your conviction gets overturned. So, that was a moment of too much honesty from Leo probably. But anyways, so there's just all sorts of bad things going on here with Aguero and Leo. The other problem we have with Aguero is the fact that people seem to suddenly have a lot more information after they meet with him. And we've talked about this before. You've got the Laffoons who went from not knowing anything about the case until meeting with Aguero a year and a half later, and all of a sudden they have this key piece of evidence, this key testimony that ties everything together, that confirms what Alice Scott said. If you only have one witness, it's a problem. If you have two witnesses, all of a sudden you have something that seems a lot more reliable. And given that information seems to have just sprung from this meeting with Aguero, it makes you wonder, given sort of the other things Aguero has done, do we have reason to doubt him? Do we have reason to think maybe he's putting information in people's heads? The last thing we're going to talk about later, and it's the reason that Aguero ends up a witness. And the fact that he does what he does, to me, makes me much more likely to believe the things that we've talked about tonight, but we'll get to that next time. So that's basically the conclusion of the trial. We did it. And it's 1989, and after a lengthy trial, but only 2 hours of deliberation, Leo is convicted for the murder of his wife. And he has maintained his innocence to this day. So this is what I want you guys to do. If you've listened, this is basically the entire trial. And we've given you pretty much everything. You guys can read the trial testimony if you want to. We've put it up on the website. I want you all to decide now whether or not you think Leo's guilty, number one. Number two, whether you would have convicted him if you had been on the jury. Have you heard enough? If you're one of those 10, because we only have 10, we don't have 12. So if you're one of those 10 people who are on that jury, based on what you've heard, would you convict? And we gave you more than the jury had. So we gave you sort of follow-up information on Alice Scott and some other stuff that didn't really come out. But nevertheless, have you heard enough? Do you think Leo's guilty? Is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? If he's not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, do you still think he's guilty? Like, are you like, look, I don't know if I'd convict, but I think he did it? Or do you think he's innocent? I want you guys to make that decision for yourself based on where we're at in the case. And then next week, we're going to talk about what happened after the trial was over, leading up to the present day. And I want to ask you yet, Alice, to say what you would have done if you were a juror. I'm not asking you. You can continue to think about it. Yeah, don't answer it. Yeah, I want everybody to think about it.
Wait, are you asking me now? Oh, I was going to say, I don't want to answer because I want people to think about it. And this is really interesting, especially those of you who've listened to Bone Valley, you know what's coming up. But this is very important. We are talking about a trial with 10 jurors, a trial, and this is what's been presented them. And we gave it to you in the order that they basically saw it as well. There's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, it's been really interesting to hear your feedback about what you thought about Leo as each episode's gone on. But this is it. Remember what happens for a jury. You're instructed to do this. You're only able to deliberate based on the evidence that's been presented in trial to you. And that is what you deliberate on. So with that, don't bring in your other knowledge after the fact that you may or may not have with what we have today before we move on.
Yeah, but I'll just tell you, what we're going to talk about next week, whatever you think now, it's gonna kind of send you for a loop. So just be prepared for some twists and turns. Well, I know we've gone late, Alice, but do you want to answer one question before we sign off? This is a nice one. This is from KG is awesome. Sorry. I had to sort of decipher that. KG is awesome. And KG is awesome wants to know, where did you both get married to your respective spouses? Alice, I'll let you go first.
I thought that the question was going to be, where did you guys get married? And I was like, should we break it to KG is awesome, we're not married? I got married in Conroe, Texas, which is north of Houston. I have no ties to Conroe. The reason I got married there is I wanted it to be in the hill country because I grew up in Austin, but Austin was too far from where I was living at the time to like plan a wedding and drive back and forth. So I kind of picked this like smaller town that had a lake and kind of like rolling hills like Austin. And I liked that it was in the middle of nowhere. Like we got married on, I don't know, a couple 100 acres of like woods, which was beautiful.
That does sound beautiful. And I've seen photographs, and you were a lovely bride, Alice.
Not to you, Brett.
So, but not to me. She did not get married to me, despite what some people may think. So my wife and I met in Alabama, and 15 years to the day after we met, dated for a long time, we got married in Tuscaloosa at the ruins of the old state capitol building. So the first state capitol in Alabama was in Tuscaloosa. And then years later, it burned down. And so they turned sort of what's left of it into this park. And as some of you guys know, my wife and I, we traveled a lot, traveled around the world, and we love going to ruins. Big fans of ruins. So this was sort of the perfect place for us to get married. So we got married there, and the two judges for whom I clerked actually married us. So I feel like that means our marriage is more legally binding, if not as religiously binding, since it was two judges. But it was two. So that should count for something. Anyways. All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. But we'll be back next week with more of this story for you guys and all those twists and turns. So we want to hear what you think. shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod, for all your social media. Hello to those of you watching on YouTube, and thank you so much to our patrons who do so much to support us and appear here and are never anything but supportive in the chat. We're so glad to record these things in person for you guys, especially you, Lillian. All right, Alice, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I love the chat because they're very supportive of me. I'll say that much. No, I love this. We've been doing it about a year now where we record episodes live. I love getting to see your face, Brett. I really do. I think it makes it more fun to actually have a conversation with you because we record remotely from each other. So I like the Zoom effect.
I like it too. Now, even when we record without a
That's
audience,
true. We do ads
so
like
we can
this.
see each other. So yeah, so it's nice. All right, well, we'll be back next week with more on this really amazing case. But until then, okay.
Did you see how efficient that was?
That was so efficient.
Okay. Leo, we're going to get through this. I mean, it might be a 5-hour episode, but we can do it.
Who's winning?
And
Kansas
we've added
City.
questions. Kansas, of course,
Sorry.
because Taylor's there.
Taylor's there. Okay, so
I'm wearing like what I call my Mean Girls I'm a cool mom jumpsuit.
Oh, is that right?
It's like a velour jumpsuit
okay.
that I've had for like 10 years. And I saw it today and I was like, today is the day I wear this velour jumpsuit because
Nice.
it's freezing outside. Yay, way to call
Yay.
it, man.
Oh, you know, I love Lillian.
Look, all I have to say is, still haven't even touched that award.
It's right there. I mean, you can look at it. You see it over my shoulder? See it?